The golden rays of dawn spilled across Ouagadougou, painting the capital of Burkina Faso in shades of promise and determination. It was a morning unlike any other, as the nation's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, prepared to announce a decision that would shake the foundations of colonial-era borders in Africa. In the crowded conference hall of the presidential palace, reporters from across the continent jostled for space, their cameras ready to capture history in the making. For months, whispers had circulated in diplomatic circles. Traore was planning something monumental. His fiery speeches had hinted at it. His relentless push for African unity had made it clear this was no ordinary leader. And now, with a calm but determined face, he was about to pull back a curtain that had hung over Africa for more than a century. Traore stood behind a podium adorned with both the Burkina Faso flag and the Pan-African flag. His military beret rested firmly on his head, a symbol of strength and defiance. With a deep breath, he began. "My fellow Africans, for too long, invisible chains have divided us. Lines drawn by colonial powers have separated brothers from sisters, mothers from sons. Borders designed to weaken us have made us strangers to one another. Today, Burkina Faso says, enough is enough." A hush fell over the room. Effective immediately, all visa fees for citizens of African countries entering Burkina Faso are abolished. No African shall ever again pay to step foot on Burkinabe soil. "This land belongs to all of us." Gasps filled the room, followed by thunderous applause. Some journalists wiped tears from their eyes. This was more than a policy. It was a declaration of war against a legacy of colonialism that had long crippled Africa's unity. Within minutes, the announcement went viral. African youth across social media hailed Traore as a hero, sharing his speech under hashtags like #AfricanUnity and #BordersFall. In Ghana, students marched in support, waving Burkina Faso's flag alongside their own. In Nigeria, activists gathered at embassies, demanding their leaders follow suit. But the decision also rattled the international community. In Paris, officials called emergency meetings, concerned that Traore's actions would encourage other African nations to reject visa fees and weaken Western economic influence. European newspapers labeled him the young rebel, while African publications hailed him as the Lion of the Sahel. Traore had been planning this move for months, inspired by African visionaries like Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara. He had studied the economic and social impact of visa fees and discovered that these barriers were generating minimal revenue while suffocating trade, tourism, and cultural exchange between African nations. He had also listened to stories from villagers in Burkina Faso's border regions. Families torn apart by border restrictions, traders harassed by immigration officers, and students denied opportunities because their passport carried the wrong emblem. The colonial borders, drawn by Europeans at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, had outlived their creators, yet still divided communities who once lived in harmony. For Traore, removing visa fees was not just about economics, it was a moral duty. Behind closed doors, this decision had sparked intense debates within Traore's cabinet. Some ministers warned that removing visa fees would deprive Burkina Faso of crucial revenue. Others feared it might invite security challenges, given the terrorist activity in the Sahel. But Traore's voice had been unwavering. "If we continue to treat our African brothers and sisters as foreigners, we are no better than those who colonized us. We must trust our people. Unity is security." He had already taken steps to strengthen the nation's borders, deploying more advanced surveillance systems and increasing military patrols. His bold partnerships with Russia and China had ensured Burkina Faso was receiving the weapons and technology needed to secure its territory without alienating fellow Africans. The announcement reverberated across villages and cities alike. In the small border town of Bitou, elderly women danced with joy, remembering a time when they could cross into neighboring Togo without being stopped by border guards. Traders at bustling open-air markets celebrated the prospect of selling their goods more freely. In Ouagadougou's universities, young students celebrated Traore as a leader who understood their dreams. Many spoke of visiting Ghana, Nigeria, or Kenya without worrying about visa applications or bribes at border posts. For the first time in decades, the vision of a borderless Africa seemed tangible. However, this move was not without opposition. Some neighboring governments were uneasy, fearing that a wave of migration could overwhelm their economies if they followed Traore's lead. Western diplomats issued thinly veiled threats of sanctions, warning that Burkina Faso's policies could destabilize regional security. But Traore stood firm. In a private meeting with his closest advisors, he reportedly said, "They fear a united Africa because they know our strength. Let them fear. We will not kneel." His words ignited a renewed sense of pride among Burkinabe citizens. Crowds poured into the streets, waving Pan-African flags and chanting his name. The decision had not only lifted visa fees, it had sparked a movement. In the weeks that followed, other African leaders began to take notice. Senegal's president hinted at a similar policy, while Ghana expressed interest in harmonizing visa requirements with Burkina Faso. Even nations in North Africa, historically distant from sub-Saharan politics, were discussing the potential of a visa-free African continent. International media portrayed Traore as a revolutionary figure, comparing him to Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Nelson Mandela. But unlike those leaders, Traore was wielding modern tools: social media campaigns, satellite security systems, and strategic alliances to push his vision forward. And so, the world watched closely as a young captain dared to dismantle one of colonialism's most enduring legacies. In Paris, the Élysée Palace was buzzing. French President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency meeting with his foreign ministers and intelligence chiefs. To France, Traore's decision wasn't just about visas, it was an attack on decades of soft power in Africa. France's influence had already been waning in the Sahel, and now this bold step was threatening to unravel colonial-era agreements altogether. "First he threw out our troops, now this," Macron reportedly said, slamming his fist on the table. "If Burkina Faso succeeds, others will follow. We'll lose the entire region." In Washington, the reaction was equally tense. A classified cable sent to the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou revealed growing anxiety. Traore is galvanizing Pan-African sentiment at an unprecedented rate. "We must monitor this closely." Meanwhile, European Union officials called for dialogue, but privately discussed sanctioning Burkina Faso's trade deals. Yet these warnings seemed to only strengthen Traore's resolve. Across Africa, ordinary citizens erupted with excitement. In Nairobi, Kenyan students organized a solidarity march, carrying banners that read, "Borders divide us, Traore unites us." In Lagos, Nigerian traders praised Burkina Faso's boldness, saying it was a wake-up call for African governments to prioritize their people over colonial-era policies. Social media was flooded with videos of African travelers burning old visa application forms as a symbolic gesture of freedom. TikTok clips showed Burkinabe border officers waving travelers through with smiles, no fees collected, just passports stamped in seconds. For the first time in decades, Africans began dreaming of a truly united continent. The hashtag #FreeAfrica trended for days, with millions calling for their leaders to follow Traore's example. But not all were pleased. Some African elites, especially those benefiting from the old system, saw this as a threat to their political control. Leaders of neighboring nations like Ivory Coast and Niger quietly criticized Traore, claiming his policy was reckless and could lead to security risks. In an emergency ECOWAS summit held in Abuja, representatives of several West African states debated whether to pressure Burkina Faso to reverse the decision. A senior Nigerian diplomat was caught on a hot mic saying, "This young man is tearing down the system we built for decades. He'll make us look like fools." Yet Traore was unbothered. He refused to attend the summit, releasing a statement instead. "If Africa fears Africans, then who are we protecting? It is time to choose between fear and freedom." On the ground, Burkina Faso's border towns became living symbols of this revolution. The usually tense border crossing at Sinkas, between Burkina Faso and Togo, was suddenly alive with music and dancing. Traders poured through the checkpoint with their goods, free from bribes and fees. Families separated by decades of red tape embraced each other with tears streaming down their faces. In the northern regions, however, security forces doubled their patrols. Traore was no fool. he knew terrorist groups could try to exploit this policy. New biometric scanners and surveillance drones were deployed at key border posts, ensuring freedom didn't come at the cost of safety. Murals of Traore began appearing across Ouagadougou. One painting showed him breaking chains with his bare hands. Another depicted him holding the Pan-African flag high over a crumbling colonial map. To many, he wasn't just a president. He was becoming a symbol of African liberation. International journalists swarmed Burkina Faso, eager to understand this sudden wave of change. A reporter from Al Jazeera wrote, "In the heart of the Sahel, a young soldier has declared war on borders, and in doing so, he has captured the soul of an entire continent." Traore's bold move quickly became a hot topic at the United Nations. Western diplomats accused him of destabilizing Africa, while representatives from countries like South Africa and Ethiopia praised his courage. During one heated debate, Traore delivered a fiery speech that echoed Thomas Sankara's revolutionary spirit. "You fear a united Africa because you know we would rise. For centuries, you divided us to rule us. But the time has come for us to rule ourselves, to trade with ourselves, to travel freely among ourselves. We are not asking for permission, we are taking our freedom." His words electrified the African delegation and caused murmurs among European leaders. The speech was broadcast live across Africa, cementing his status as a revolutionary leader. Tourism skyrocketed almost immediately. Within weeks, Burkina Faso saw a surge of African visitors. Businessmen from Lagos, artists from Dakar, students from Kigali, all eager to experience a country breaking free from colonial-era restrictions. Local markets thrived, hotels overflowed, and inter-African trade began to see a sudden boost. Economists were stunned. Analysts had predicted Burkina Faso would lose revenue from visa fees. But instead, the open border policy was drawing investment and strengthening its regional influence. Other African nations began to reconsider their own border policies, fearful of being left behind in this new wave of Pan-Africanism. In Washington, a closed-door meeting was underway at the Pentagon. Satellite images of Burkina Faso's borders flashed on screens as military analysts and diplomats dissected Traore's policies. Reports suggested that Burkina Faso was becoming a hub for Pan-African solidarity, and Western powers feared it could inspire a domino effect across the continent. A senior U.S. official spoke gravely. "If this spreads, Africa will start controlling its own trade and migration. That means fewer economic levers for us. We can't allow Traore to turn Burkina Faso into a symbol of rebellion." Across the Atlantic, French intelligence agencies were equally alarmed. Leaked memos revealed plans to destabilize Burkina Faso's economy through sanctions, propaganda, and covert operations. One French diplomat, speaking anonymously, admitted, "We underestimated him. He's young, but he's dangerous because he inspires hope." Rumors swirled that mercenaries, possibly backed by foreign interests, were already being smuggled into the Sahel to create unrest. Traore's security team intercepted encrypted messages suggesting a plot to sabotage border security systems. While foreign powers schemed, the African people were awakening. In Johannesburg, a group of Pan-African activists staged a rally, holding massive banners that read, "We are one Africa." In Accra, students painted murals of Traore next to portraits of Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara, calling him the heir of the revolution. African musicians began releasing songs celebrating Burkina Faso's decision. A Nigerian Afrobeat star dropped a viral track titled "No Borders," with lyrics praising Traore's courage. The anthem became a rallying cry for the youth, blasting from taxis, nightclubs, and protests alike. Even in countries with authoritarian leaders, whispers of admiration for Traore's boldness spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a policy change anymore. It was a movement. As Burkina Faso's tourism and trade blossomed, Western nations imposed a series of sanctions, attempting to cripple the country's financial sector. Several international banks cut ties, and European travel advisories labeled Burkina Faso unstable. But Traore was ready. Months before the announcement, he had quietly strengthened partnerships with Russia, China, and several Middle Eastern nations. Cargo planes carrying technology, fuel, and investment deals began arriving in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso's central bank introduced a Pan-African payment system to bypass Western currency controls, further angering former colonial powers. At a press conference, Traore confidently declared, "You cannot starve a people who have already learned to farm their own food. You cannot scare a generation that has chosen freedom over comfort." Sensing momentum, Traore organized a Pan-African Unity Summit in Ouagadougou. Leaders from over 20 African nations attended, some secretly, wary of backlash from Western allies. The summit was broadcast across the continent, showing African presidents, ministers, and activists seated in a massive hall draped in Pan-African colors. In his opening address, Traore called for a bold vision. "Our colonial masters divided us with borders. Now we shall unite ourselves with roads, trade, and trust. Burkina Faso is only the beginning. Imagine an Africa where our people move freely, where a passport is not a barrier but a bridge." The audience erupted in cheers. Some leaders, moved by the passion of the people, pledged to remove visa restrictions for Africans entering their countries. The idea of a borderless Africa was no longer a dream. It was a growing reality. However, Traore's boldness also sparked dissent at home. A faction of Burkinabe politicians, secretly backed by foreign interests, began plotting against him. Leaked recordings revealed a group of wealthy businessmen complaining about losing visa fee revenue and warning that Burkina Faso was becoming a playground for radicals. Security forces reported suspicious movements near the borders, with intelligence suggesting attempts to smuggle weapons into the country. Traore responded swiftly, deploying elite units to secure key checkpoints and arresting several suspected saboteurs. His message was clear: "We will welcome Africans as brothers, but we will not welcome chaos." Despite these challenges, the Burkinabe people stood firmly behind their leader. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands filled the streets, chanting his name and waving flags from across Africa. Volunteer patrols formed in villages to help monitor suspicious activity, ensuring that enemies of unity would not succeed easily. A viral video captured an elderly woman in Bobo Dioulasso saying, "We've been divided for too long. Traore is doing what Sankara dreamed of. If they come for him, they will have to pass through us first." That statement summed up the sentiment of millions. Traore was no longer just a president. He was a symbol of defiance, a beacon for all Africans longing for dignity and freedom. As Burkina Faso's visa-free policy inspired countries like Mali and Senegal to adopt similar measures, whispers began circulating about a larger, bolder plan, a unified African passport, free from colonial influence. Western powers scrambled to regain control, while African youth movements grew louder, pushing their leaders to follow Traore's path. The tension was building, and it was clear that something seismic was on the horizon. The sun was just setting over Ouagadougou when Traore's Security Council received an encrypted message from an allied intelligence network. It detailed a chilling plan. A team of mercenaries had been paid to infiltrate Burkina Faso through its northern borders. Their mission wasn't merely to destabilize the country. It was to assassinate Captain Ibrahim Traore and crush his vision of a borderless Africa before it spread too far. The report named a French private security firm with ties to old colonial networks as the source of funding. Traore's closest advisors urged him to stay in the heavily fortified presidential palace, but he refused. "If I hide, they win. Let them see me walking these streets. Let them know I'm not afraid," he said, adjusting his beret and striding toward a rally where thousands had gathered to celebrate the visa policy. While mercenaries plotted in secret, the African people were rising like never before. In Bamako, Mali's interim president announced that Mali would join Burkina Faso in abolishing visa fees for all African travelers. Senegal followed suit days later. A wave of unity swept across the continent. In Nairobi, African tech startups began working on a single digital African ID system, designed to replace colonial-era passports. In Lagos, Nigerian activists launched a petition demanding their government adopt Burkina Faso's policy, gathering millions of signatures in less than a week. The West was rattled. A leaked European Union memo warned that Africa was slipping out of Western influence at an alarming pace. One humid night, as Traore's convoy returned from a rural border village, a suspicious pickup truck blocked the road. His security team sprang into action, surrounding the vehicle. Before they could investigate, gunfire erupted from nearby trees. It was an ambush. Bullets whizzed past, But Traore remained calm. His bodyguards quickly returned fire while a backup unit flanked the attackers. Within minutes, several mercenaries lay dead, and others were captured alive. Interrogations later revealed that the attackers had been promised a fortune to eliminate the young leader. They carried European-made rifles, and their communication devices traced back to a foreign intelligence network. The incident only fueled Traore's determination. In a televised address the next day, he stood tall in his military fatigues and declared, "They tried to kill me because they fear the rise of Africa. But let them know this: we will not stop. We will not bow. No bullet can silence a dream whose time has come." The streets of Ouagadougou erupted in cheers. Across Africa, Traore's courage became a rallying cry. Soon after the assassination attempt, Burkina Faso hosted an emergency meeting with leaders from Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Guinea. They announced plans to create a single African passport for West African nations, allowing their citizens to travel freely without restrictions. The announcement was met with thunderous applause at a packed stadium rally, where Traore stood alongside other African leaders. Flags from across the continent waved as crowds chanted, "Africa Unite!" News outlets called it the second wave of Pan-Africanism, comparing it to the decolonization movements of the 1960s. But this was different. This was about dismantling the invisible chains that colonial powers had left behind. In Washington and Paris, leaders scrambled to regain control. New sanctions were announced, targeting Burkina Faso's mining industry and trade routes. Western media outlets launched smear campaigns, portraying Traore as a dictator destabilizing the region. But the African people didn't buy the narrative. Social media influencers, artists, and musicians from across the continent united in defense of Traore. A viral video showed a group of Congolese schoolchildren holding a sign that read, "Captain Traore, our hero." Burkina Faso's economy, instead of collapsing, began thriving under regional trade agreements. Countries like Algeria and Morocco expressed interest in joining the movement, further isolating Western powers. Murals of Thomas Sankara began appearing beside Traore's likeness, with captions reading, "The dream continues." Sankara's vision of a united, self-reliant Africa seemed closer than ever, and Traore embraced that legacy. At a Pan-African cultural festival in Ouagadougou, Traore spoke to a crowd of thousands. "They told us independence was freedom, yet they kept our chains in place with borders and visas. Today, we break those chains, not with weapons but with unity. Burkina Faso is not leading Africa. Africa is leading itself." The speech went viral, sparking massive pro-unity protests in several African capitals. Young Africans began referring to this era as the Great Reawakening. But as Traore's movement gained momentum, darker whispers emerged. Intelligence officers intercepted chatter of a Phase 2 plan, something far deadlier than an ambush. Some feared that foreign powers, desperate to stop this movement, might resort to economic sabotage or even orchestrate a coup. Late at night, in his presidential office, Traore pored over intelligence files. He knew he was walking a dangerous path. Yet, he also knew Africa was watching him, drawing strength from his courage. He whispered to himself, "Even if I fall, the dream will not die." And somewhere beyond Burkina Faso's borders, plans were already in motion to test his resolve. In the dimly lit headquarters of Burkina Faso's intelligence service, a sense of urgency hung heavy in the air. Analysts stared at encrypted messages intercepted from a foreign server, their faces pale with shock. The chatter hinted at a sophisticated plan to topple Captain Ibrahim Traore, not with bullets this time, but with whispers, sabotage, and betrayal. The documents revealed a coalition of powerful foreign interests, former colonial actors, and African elites who felt threatened by Traore's reforms. They called it Operation Stabilize, but it was nothing short of a silent coup. Key members of Burkina Faso's financial sector were being pressured to sabotage the currency reforms Traore had initiated. Smugglers were paid to flood the black market with counterfeit goods, destabilizing the economy. Even high-ranking military officers were being tempted with promises of wealth and political power if they turned against him. Traore read the dossier in silence, his jaw tight. He had faced assassins, but this was a different war, a war of deception. They can bribe generals, But they cannot bribe a nation's spirit, he said, tossing the file onto the table. When rumors of a coup began spreading, Burkina Faso's streets erupted with defiance. Tens of thousands of citizens flooded Ouagadougou's Independence Square, chanting Traore's name and carrying Pan-African flags. Traders from Mali, farmers from Ghana, students from Senegal, all gathered in solidarity. Women formed human shields around the presidential palace, holding placards that read, "Touch Traore, touch Africa." One Burkinabe elder, interviewed by local media, said, "We have seen their tricks before. They killed Sankara and thought they killed his dream. But now the dream is alive, and no foreign power will take it from us." As the threats intensified, Traore's alliances deepened. Mali, Niger, and Guinea announced a joint security pact, pledging to defend Burkina Faso if destabilization attempts escalated. Russia offered cybersecurity experts to help counter hacking attempts on Burkina Faso's financial networks, while China pledged millions in infrastructure support to strengthen the country's independence. An African diplomatic bloc began forming quietly, with leaders from South Africa, Tanzania, and Algeria expressing support for a continental visa-free policy. At a late-night meeting in Ouagadougou, Traore looked around the table at his allies and said, "They thought we would stand alone, but they have awakened Africa." Western sanctions bit hard at first. Certain trade routes slowed, and foreign investors withdrew. But Traore's government had anticipated this. They had already signed new trade agreements with neighboring African nations, creating a pan-African corridor for goods. Markets in Ouagadougou bustled with African produce, fabrics, and electronics, proudly labeled "Made in Africa." The elimination of visa fees meant more traders, more tourists, and more business deals happening daily. In a televised broadcast, Traore stood beside African entrepreneurs and said, "They wanted to starve us, but look at us feeding ourselves. Africa does not need permission to prosper." Meanwhile, Western media outlets ran stories painting Traore as a dictator, claiming Burkina Faso was descending into chaos. False reports of human rights violations circulated online, but African social media influencers fought back, sharing videos of bustling markets, schools being built, and tourists entering freely. A Burkinabe student in Dakar posted a viral video. "They say he is a dictator, but no dictator tears down borders to unite his people." The narrative war had begun, and Africa was winning. One night, as Traore walked the palace corridors, he paused by a large map of Africa on the wall. Dozens of pins marked countries now in talks to join the visa-free movement. He traced his finger along the borders, whispering, "These lines are scars. We will heal them." But even as hope surged, intelligence briefings grew darker. A network of foreign operatives was smuggling weapons into neighboring countries, preparing for something big, something that could plunge Burkina Faso into chaos. The documents only referred to it cryptically, Phase 2, Final Disruption. Traore knew what it meant. If economic sabotage and assassination attempts had failed, his enemies might attempt a full-scale military coup, or worse, a regional conflict designed to discredit his movement. He turned to his chief of security, eyes burning with determination. "Strengthen every border post. Double intelligence patrols. And tell the people to stay vigilant. If they come for me, they will find all of Africa standing in their way." Despite the threats, Burkina Faso's vision was spreading faster than its enemies could react. Kenya's government announced a visa-free policy for all African travelers. Rwanda followed, offering simplified entry procedures. Even North African countries, long separated by cultural and historical divides, began reconsidering their policies. A historic moment came when African Union representatives gathered in Addis Ababa to discuss a single African passport. Delegates spoke with passion, some openly crediting Traore as the spark of a new revolution. In the streets of Ouagadougou, a massive mural appeared overnight. It showed Traore standing atop a shattered chain, holding a torch high while dozens of African leaders stood behind him. At the bottom, the words read, "Africa cannot be stopped." For now, life in Burkina Faso was vibrant. Borders were open, trade was booming, and unity was spreading like wildfire. Yet, Traore felt the weight of what was coming. Late at night, he wrote a letter to his people, to be read only if something happened to him. It was a letter of hope, a reminder that the dream was bigger than one man. "If I fall," he wrote, "do not mourn me. Rise stronger. This is not my fight. It is ours. No border can cage a free people." As he placed the letter in a secure envelope, a distant rumble echoed across the city, the sound of armored vehicles moving under the cover of darkness. Phase 2 had begun. The night sky over Ouagadougou glimmered faintly under a full moon, but the streets were eerily quiet. In the shadows, unmarked armored vehicles crept through back roads, carrying heavily armed men. They weren't wearing Burkina Faso's uniforms. This was a mercenary strike team, recruited from across borders and funded by shadowy foreign interests. At exactly 2:15 a.m., explosions rocked the outskirts of the capital. Power grids were hit, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Gunfire followed, echoing through the empty streets as residents huddled inside their homes, terrified. In the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traore was already awake, dressed in full military fatigues. His security chief burst through the door. "Sir, it's begun. They're attacking from 3 directions. We have to move you now." But Traore refused to flee. "If I run, Burkina Faso falls tonight," he said firmly, grabbing his rifle. "Take me to the command center." Deep beneath the palace, a war room buzzed with activity. Maps lit up with red markers showing enemy positions. Intelligence officers confirmed that the attackers were well-equipped and had insider knowledge of security routes. General Kassim, Traore's most trusted military commander, slammed his fist on the table. "They've infiltrated our ranks, Captain. Some of these men know our tactics, but we've sealed the palace perimeter. We're holding for now." Traore nodded. "We hold, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa. If I fall, they'll crush this dream before it spreads." Orders flew out rapidly. Armored vehicles moved to block key roads, while drones launched from hidden hangars to provide real-time visuals. Volunteers from the People's Defense Brigades, a civilian force inspired by Traore's reforms, armed themselves and poured into the streets to defend their neighborhoods. The attackers struck with precision, targeting the national broadcasting station and the central bank. Flames engulfed buildings, and gunfire crackled through the air. But something unexpected happened. Ordinary Burkinabe citizens began fighting back. In the district of Gaunfin, men and women formed barricades, hurling stones and Molotov cocktails at the mercenaries. In the heart of the city, students linked arms to block access roads, shouting, "Touch Traore, touch Africa." Local radio stations, operating from secret underground rooms, broadcast rallying cries. "Defend your streets, defend your president, defend Africa's freedom." The city became a battlefield, but also a symbol of resistance. As chaos spread, Burkina Faso's allies moved swiftly. Mali and Niger activated the Sahel Joint Defense Pact, sending special forces racing toward the Burkinabe border. Guinea deployed drones to provide air surveillance, while Russia quietly dispatched cyber warfare experts to shut down the enemy's communications. Within hours, African social media exploded with live updates. Videos of Burkinabe civilians standing alongside soldiers went viral, inspiring protests and rallies in cities like Accra, Lagos, and Nairobi. Hashtags like #StandWithBurkina and #DefendTraore trended worldwide. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session. Delegates debated invoking collective security measures for the first time in history. The Nigerian representative, once a critic of Traore, stood and declared, "If Burkina Faso falls tonight, Africa loses tomorrow. We must act." By dawn, enemy forces surrounded the presidential palace. Traore stood at a fortified balcony, overlooking the smoking city. He was calm but unyielding, clutching his rifle while his security detail reinforced the gates. "They think this ends with me," he said quietly to General Kassim. "But they don't understand Africa has woken up." Suddenly, the palace courtyard shook under the impact of a rocket-propelled grenade. Dust and debris filled the air. Traore's guards shielded him, but he refused to retreat deeper into the bunker. "I stay here," he ordered. "If the people see me fight, they'll never surrender." Across Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens fought back with a ferocity no mercenary army could have predicted. Mechanics turned their workshops into makeshift weapons depots. Farmers arrived with tractors, blocking major intersections. Youth groups, armed with little more than machetes and courage, ambushed enemy vehicles using their knowledge of the city's alleys. By midday, resistance forces began regaining control of key districts. Videos emerged of Burkinabe villagers marching toward the capital, carrying hunting rifles and spears, chanting war songs from the revolutionary days of Thomas Sankara. The tide was turning, but the attackers were far from finished. Intelligence intercepted a chilling message from the enemy's command. If we can't take Traore alive, level the palace. In a desperate yet defiant move, Traore broadcast live from the palace. His face was smeared with dirt, and explosions echoed in the distance. Africans, this is not just about Burkina Faso. They come for me because they fear what we have begun. If they kill me, they kill the hope of a free Africa. Rise. Stand with us. This is your fight. The speech electrified the continent. Across Africa, demonstrations erupted in support of Traore. In Johannesburg, protesters flooded the streets outside foreign embassies. In Dakar, thousands marched carrying banners reading, "Burkina today, Africa tomorrow." Even African leaders who had stayed silent now spoke out, condemning the attack. A coalition of nations prepared to send reinforcements. The fight for Burkina Faso had become the fight for Africa. By nightfall, Ouagadougou resembled a war zone. Smoke curled into the night sky as tracer rounds lit up the streets. The palace remained under siege, but reinforcements from Mali and Niger were less than 2 hours away. Traore sat at the command table, surrounded by his generals and advisors. His voice was steady. Tonight, they learned that Africa bows to no one. Hold every gate. Hold every street. We fight until the sun rises. Outside, the chants of civilians echoed through the gunfire. Long live Traore! Long live Africa! The world was watching. The fate of a continent's dream of unity hung in the balance. And in the darkness, enemy forces regrouped for one final push. One that could either cement Traore's vision or plunge Burkina Faso into chaos. The night sky over Ouagadougou burned red with flames as explosions echoed through the streets. The mercenary forces had regrouped for their last assault, determined to bring down Traore and crush the hope he had ignited across Africa. Inside the palace, alarms blared. Generals barked orders, soldiers scrambled to defensive positions, and the sound of heavy gunfire grew closer. Captain Ibrahim Traore stood at the heart of it all, calm yet fierce, his rifle slung across his chest. "We hold this ground," he said firmly. "Not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African child who dreams of a united continent. Let them come." Moments later, rockets slammed into the palace gates, sending debris flying. Mercenaries stormed forward in waves, firing indiscriminately. But instead of retreating, Traore and his guards stood their ground. Burkinabe snipers picked off attackers from rooftops, while armored vehicles flanked the advancing enemy. Suddenly, a loud roar erupted from the distance. Reinforcements had arrived. Malian and Nigerian special forces thundered into the capital, supported by Guinean drones buzzing overhead. The streets lit up as reinforcements engaged the mercenaries head-on. Local militias and civilian brigades joined the fight, attacking the invaders with machetes, slingshots, and sheer bravery. The enemy, expecting an easy victory, was overwhelmed by the united resistance. For the first time that night, fear spread among their ranks. At one intersection, villagers carrying hunting rifles ambushed a convoy of mercenaries, chanting Sankara-era war songs as they fought. Across the city, women and children supplied soldiers with food and ammunition, turning neighborhoods into fortresses of defiance. The coup plotters had underestimated not just Traore, but the spirit of an entire nation. In the palace courtyard, a fierce gun battle raged. Traore himself led the charge, rallying his troops with unmatched courage. Under his leadership, palace guards pushed back the attackers, reclaiming ground inch by inch. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through the mercenary command vehicle, knocking out their communications network. The blast was later traced to a daring drone strike from Burkinabe forces, guided by intel from Russian cyber teams. With their coordination shattered and morale broken, the mercenary army began retreating. Some tried to flee the city, but roadblocks manned by civilians and allied soldiers cut off every escape route. By dawn, the last of the attackers had surrendered or been neutralized. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the smoky sky, a deafening cheer rose from the streets of Ouagadougou. Civilians poured out of their homes, waving Pan-African flags and chanting Traore's name. Soldiers, bruised and exhausted, hugged one another in tears. Captain Ibrahim Traore emerged from the palace balcony, his beret dusty, his uniform smeared with soot. He raised his fist high, and the crowd erupted in chants. Africa! 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 In a live broadcast carried across the continent, Traore addressed his people and all of Africa. They sent guns to silence us, but our unity was louder. They sent mercenaries to divide us, but we stood together. Burkina Faso is not alone. Africa is awake. Let this day be a message. No empire, no border, and no oppressor will stop a united Africa. His words were met with thunderous applause that echoed across Ouagadougou and beyond. In the days that followed, Burkina Faso became a symbol of resistance. Videos of civilians defending their streets went viral, inspiring protests and reform movements across Africa. Within weeks, several African nations, including Senegal, Kenya, and Ghana, announced they would abolish visa fees for African travelers, joining Traore's vision of a borderless continent. The African Union convened a historic summit in Addis Ababa, declaring the creation of a roadmap for a single African passport. Traore was hailed as a hero, not just for surviving the coup attempt, but for uniting Africa in a way not seen since the independence struggles of the 20th century. Western powers, embarrassed by their failure, issued hollow statements calling for stability, but their influence had been shattered. Africa was no longer looking outward for leadership, it was looking inward, to itself. Weeks later, murals of Traore adorned the streets of every major Burkinabe city, alongside portraits of Thomas Sankara. Songs were written about his courage, and school children learned of the night of unity, when Burkina Faso stood against foreign interference and triumphed. But Traore remained humble. Speaking at a memorial for those who died defending the city, he said, "This victory was not mine, it was yours. The real heroes are the mothers who stood at roadblocks, the farmers who marched to defend this city, the youth who refused to bow. Today we honor them, and tomorrow we continue the work of building a free Africa." Within a year, more than half of Africa had joined the movement to eliminate visa fees for fellow Africans. Trade flourished, tourism exploded, and for the first time in generations, Africans could travel across their own continent without fear of bureaucracy or exploitation. And in Ouagadougou, the palace balcony where Traore stood that fateful dawn became a symbol of hope, a reminder that a young captain dared to dream of a united Africa and lived to see the dream come true. Though enemies still schemed in the shadows, Africa had spoken. The chains of colonialism had been broken, not with treaties, but with courage. And Ibrahim Traore's name would forever be etched in history as the man who turned borders into bridges. Thank you for watching.